In 2013, a Palo Alto startup promised to replace the blood draw. One drop from a finger prick, run through a small black box called the Edison, could supposedly deliver over 200 lab results, cholesterol, cancer markers, infections, in minutes at a fraction of the cost. Walgreens put the machines in more than 40 stores. Investors poured in more than $700 million. The company's valuation hit $9 billion. Its founder graced magazine covers in a black turtleneck, compared often to Steve Jobs, and was for a time celebrated as the youngest self-made female billionaire in the country. The technology never worked as claimed. By the time federal prosecutors finished their case, only one of Theranos' tests had ever received FDA clearance: a check for herpes. Everything else ran on borrowed, modified commercial machines, diluted far beyond their designed limits, producing results the company's own scientists knew were unreliable. Real patients received real medical decisions based on those results, including at least one flagged case where a distorted potassium reading suggested a level high enough to indicate a medical emergency that further testing showed did not exist. Elizabeth Holmes founded Theranos in 2003 after dropping out of Stanford at 19. Her pitch was simple and appealing. Fear of needles kept people from getting tested early, and early testing saved lives. A single drop of blood, one machine, hundreds of results. Over the next decade, she raised more than $700 million from investors that included media mogul Rupert Murdoch and the family behind Walmart, largely without allowing outside technical due diligence on the device itself. Internally, the picture was different. The Edison could reliably run only a small number of tests, and even those were prone to error. For the rest, Theranos secretly ran samples on modified, off-the-shelf machines from competitors, then presented the results to investors, doctors, and regulators as if the Edison had produced them. The company diluted patient blood samples to stretch a single finger prick draw across dozens of tests, a practice its own lab staff flagged as introducing dangerous imprecision. Holmes also told investors and reporters that Theranos technology was deployed with the U.S. military in medevac helicopters and on the battlefield in Afghanistan, claims the military itself later said were not accurate. Two junior lab employees, Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung, saw the gap between the demonstrations and the data. They watched fabricated Edison results get shown to investors, while the same samples were quietly run on other companies' machines behind the scenes. Both raised internal concerns, first to company leadership, and then, when nothing changed, to state regulators. Both were dismissed, and both described being threatened with legal action for speaking up. In 2015, they became sources for Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou, whose investigation broke the story publicly and triggered the regulatory scrutiny that followed. Federal and state health inspectors who visited the company's lab afterward found conditions serious enough to bar Theranos from operating a clinical laboratory and to void thousands of patient test results. The Securities and Exchange Commission filed fraud charges against Holmes and former company president Ramesh Balwani in 2018, alleging the company had defrauded investors of more than $700 million through years of false claims about its technology, its revenue, and its relationships with the military and pharmaceutical companies. The SEC's complaint detailed how Theranos told investors it expected to generate several $100 million in revenue when the real figure for that period was closer to a few $100,000. Holmes settled the SEC's civil case without admitting wrongdoing, paying a fine and surrendering voting control of the company. The criminal case, brought separately by federal prosecutors, went to trial. The company's board of directors is where the control's failure lived. Theranos assembled a board with extraordinary political and military weight. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of Defense James Mattis, former Secretary of State George Shultz, and multiple former U.S. senators. What the board lacked was almost any member with a background in medicine, laboratory science, or diagnostics. The people positioned to ask whether the technology actually worked were the people least equipped to evaluate the claim. That gap mattered because it meant no one at the top with the standing to challenge Holmes also had the expertise to know what questions to ask. Mattis, while still a serving general, championed getting Theranos devices evaluated for battlefield use. The same claim Holmes later repeated to investors as though it were an accomplished fact rather than a pilot he had personally advocated for. And the board's failure had a personal edge. Whistleblower Tyler Schultz was the grandson of board member George Schultz, who sided with the company over his own grandson when the allegations first surfaced. Prestige stood in for scrutiny. The pattern echoes what this channel has covered before: Madoff's missing independent custodian, Enron's conflicted auditor. Here, the failure was a governance structure built for credibility rather than oversight. Holmes stood trial in 2021 on charges of conspiracy and wire fraud. During the trial, her defense argued that Balwani, also her romantic partner at the time, had controlled and psychologically abused her, shaping decisions inside the company. In January 2022, a jury convicted her on 1 count of conspiracy to defraud investors and 3 counts of wire fraud against investors, acquitted her on 4 charges tied to defrauding patients, and deadlocked on 3 additional investor wire fraud counts, which prosecutors later declined to retry. The split verdict drew a real distinction between money lost by sophisticated investors and harm claimed by patients who received results from the flawed tests. In November 2022, Judge Edward Davila sentenced her to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. She reported to custody in May 2023 after the Ninth Circuit denied her request to delay surrender, and her appeal of the conviction remains ongoing. Balwani, Theranos' former president and Holmes' former partner, was tried separately, and his defense did not include the abuse allegations Holmes raised against him. In July 2022, a jury convicted him on all 12 counts he faced, including both investor and patient fraud. He was sentenced that December to nearly 13 years, a longer term than Holmes received, reflecting his more direct operational role in the lab and the jury's rejection of any comparable mitigating narrative on his side. Theranos raised more than $700 million and reached a $9 billion valuation on a device that could reliably run almost none of what it promised. The fraud persisted for years, not because the technology was convincing to experts, but because Holmes ensured few experts were ever in the room, and because the one board member positioned by family to hear the truth first chose the company over his own grandson. A board full of prestige and empty of relevant expertise signed off on claims no qualified reviewer would have accepted, and regulators only intervened after 2 journalist sources risked their careers to say so on the record. The lesson holds across every case this channel covers. Fraud rarely survives real, independent, technically competent scrutiny. It survives its absence.